The iron skillet flew across the saloon's kitchen and clanged against the wall hard enough to leave a dent, and every man within earshot flinched at the sound that had become all too familiar in Fort Yuma, California over the past 3 months. Eleanor Grace stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her auburn hair escaping its pins in wild tendrils around her flushed face, her green eyes blazing with the kind of fire that made grown men step backward and reconsider their life choices. The year was 1874, and the summer heat beat down on the dusty streets of this frontier town nestled along the Colorado River. But the temperature inside the Lucky Dollar Saloon had nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with the 22-year-old woman who had arrived in spring with determination in her heart and a temper that could blister paint. "I told you 3 times that if you wanted supper at 5, you needed to bring me supplies by noon," Eleanor said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass as she addressed the saloon owner, a portly man named Harold Jenkins, who was currently backing toward the door with his hands raised in surrender. "You cannot expect me to conjure food from thin air, and I will not serve slop to paying customers just because you cannot manage to do your job properly." Harold's face had gone an impressive shade of purple. "Now see here, Miss Grace, I am the one who employs you, and I will not be spoken to in such a manner by a woman who should be grateful to have work at all in her position." Eleanor's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Grateful? You are lucky I have not walked out already, considering you have failed to pay me the full wage we agreed upon for the past 2 weeks. I cook better food than anyone within 100 miles, and you know it. Half the men who come through those doors come for my stew and cornbread, not your watered-down whiskey." This was true, and everyone in the saloon knew it. Eleanor Grace had appeared in Fort Yuma 3 months prior, stepping off the stagecoach with a single worn carpet bag and a letter of introduction from a cousin who had lived in the area years before. That cousin had since moved on, leaving Eleanor stranded in a town she had never seen, with skills that were valuable, but a temperament that made employment difficult. She had burned through 2 positions before Harold had hired her out of desperation when his previous cook had died of influenza. And while her food was exceptional, her willingness to speak her mind had created tension from the very beginning. The men seated at the tables watched the argument with the uncomfortable expressions of those who wanted no part in the conflict, but could not help but bear witness. Several of them had been on the receiving end of Eleanor's sharp tongue when they had made unwelcome advances or crude suggestions, and they had learned quickly that this particular woman would not tolerate disrespect in any form. She was beautiful in a fierce sort of way, with a figure that drew eyes despite the simple calico dresses she wore, and a face that might have been soft if not for the hard set of her jaw and the defensive fire that always seemed to burn in her gaze. "That is it," Harold said, his voice shaking with rage. "You are finished here, Miss Grace. Pack your things and get out. I will not have a woman with such an ungovernable temper working in my establishment." Eleanor stood perfectly still for a moment, and something flickered across her face that might have been fear before it was replaced by cold pride. "Fine, but you will pay me what you owe, or I will go to the sheriff." "The sheriff will not take the word of a woman with no family and no prospects over mine," Harold shot back. "Now get out before I have you removed." The saloon had gone completely silent. Eleanor's hands were trembling, but she clenched them into fists at her sides and lifted her chin. "You are a coward and a cheat, Harold Jenkins, and everyone in this room knows it. I hope your next cook poisons you." She turned on her heel and walked back into the kitchen, emerging a few minutes later with her carpet bag and the worn shawl she had arrived with. She walked through the saloon with her head high, refusing to let anyone see how terrified she actually was, and pushed through the doors into the brutal afternoon sun. Fort Yuma in July was not a forgiving place. The town sat at the confluence of the Gila and Colorado rivers, a strategic location that had made it important for military purposes and trade, but the heat was crushing and relentless. The temperature regularly climbed above 100 degrees, and the sun beat down on the dusty streets with merciless intensity. Eleanor stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the saloon and felt the full weight of her situation settle onto her shoulders like a physical burden. She had $12 to her name, no employment, no family, and nowhere to go. The room she had been renting above the general store was paid through the end of the week, which gave her 5 days to figure out her next move. She could try to find work at one of the other establishments in town, but Harold would spread word about her temper, and no one would want to take the risk. She could try to book passage on a stagecoach to another town, but $12 would not get her far, and she would arrive in a new place just as desperate and alone as she was now. Eleanor started walking down the street with no particular destination in mind, just needing to move and think. The town was busy despite the heat, with wagons rumbling past and people going about their business. Fort Yuma had grown considerably since the military fort had been established nearby, and it served as an important crossing point for travelers heading to California from the east. The population was a mixture of soldiers, traders, miners, families trying to build new lives, and the inevitable collection of gamblers, drifters, and opportunists that gathered anywhere money changed hands. She passed the general store, the land office, the blacksmith shop with its ringing anvil, and the small church that held services on Sundays. Several people glanced at her as she walked, and she could feel their curiosity and judgment. Single women without male protection were viewed with suspicion in places like this, and Eleanor had done nothing to endear herself to the community during her short time here. She had kept to herself, worked hard, and refused to simper or flirt or make herself small the way women were expected to do. Her feet carried her to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open desert scrub and the river glinted in the distance. She sat down on a sun-bleached log near what passed for the town's northern boundary, and finally allowed herself to acknowledge the tears burning behind her eyes. She was so tired of fighting, tired of being alone, tired of having to be hard and defensive every single moment just to survive. But she could not afford to be soft, could not afford to let anyone see weakness, because weakness got women hurt or worse in places like this. "You all right, miss?" Eleanor's head snapped up, and she found herself looking at an old prospector leading a mule loaded with supplies. His face was weathered like old leather, and his eyes were kind beneath bushy gray eyebrows. "I am fine," she said automatically, straightening her spine. The prospector studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "If you say so. Just looked like you might need some help is all. Town can be a hard place for folks on their own." "I can take care of myself," Eleanor said, her voice sharper than she intended. "I'm sure you can," the old man said mildly, "but everybody needs help sometimes. Ain't no shame in it." He tipped his hat to her and continued on his way, the mule's hooves kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. Eleanor watched him go and felt something twist in her chest. She did need help. She desperately needed help. But she had learned the hard way that accepting help often came with strings attached, with expectations and demands that she was not willing to meet. Better to stand alone than to compromise herself, even if standing alone meant falling. She stayed there until the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The heat remained oppressive, but she forced herself to stand and make her way back to town. She needed to eat something and figure out her next steps, even if those steps felt like walking into darkness with no light to guide her way. The boarding house where she rented her room was run by a stern widow named Mrs. Patterson, who made no secret of her disapproval of Eleanor's employment at the saloon. When Eleanor entered through the front door, Mrs. Patterson was in the parlor doing needlework, and she looked up with her usual expression of pinched disapproval. "You are back early, Miss Grace," she said, her tone suggesting this was somehow suspicious. "I'm no longer employed at the saloon," Eleanor said flatly. "I will be looking for new work starting tomorrow." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "I see. Well, as you know, your rent is due at the end of the week. I hope you will be able to meet your obligations." "I will manage," Eleanor said, though she had no idea how. She climbed the narrow stairs to her small room and closed the door behind her, leaning against it and closing her eyes. The room was barely large enough for the narrow bed, washstand, and small trunk that held all her possessions. She had tried to make it feel like home with a few small touches, a piece of colorful cloth draped over the trunk, a handful of wildflowers in a chipped cup on the windowsill, but it remained stubbornly impersonal, a temporary space for a temporary existence. Eleanor moved to the window and looked out at the street below. The sun was almost gone now, and lamps were being lit in windows up and down the street. She could hear the faint sound of a piano from one of the saloons, laughter and conversation drifting on the evening air. Life continued around her, indifferent to her struggles. She thought about her life before Fort Yuma, about the series of disappointments and betrayals that had led her here. She had been raised in Missouri by parents who had died within a year of each other when she was 19, leaving her with nothing but debt and a cousin who had reluctantly taken her in. That cousin's husband had made improper advances, and when Eleanor had fought back and told her cousin what had happened, she had been called a liar and thrown out. She had worked as a seamstress, a laundress, a cook in various towns, always moving on when circumstances became impossible, always alone, always fighting. The anger that lived inside her like a banked fire was not something she had chosen. It was something that had been built piece by piece from every injustice, every insult, every man who thought her lack of male protection meant she was available for the taking, every woman who had judged her for being alone and decided that meant she must be immoral. She had learned to meet the world with her fists up and her guard high, because letting it down even for a moment invited pain. But God, she was tired. She prepared for bed mechanically, washing her face in the basin and braiding her hair. She lay down on the narrow mattress and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around her. Tomorrow she would wake up and figure out her next move. Tomorrow she would be strong again. Tonight, in the privacy of her small room, she let herself feel the full weight of her exhaustion and fear. The next morning, Eleanor woke with the sun and dressed in her most respectable dress, a dark blue calico that was worn but clean and carefully mended. She twisted her hair into a neat bun and splashed water on her face, studying her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked tired, with shadows under her eyes and a tightness around her mouth that made her seem older than her 22 years. She went downstairs and had a small breakfast of bread and coffee that Mrs. Patterson provided to her boarders, then set out to look for work. She tried the hotel first, asking if they needed help in the kitchen or with laundry, but the manager took one look at her and said they had no positions available. She tried the general store, the other saloons, even the livery stable, but the answer was the same everywhere. Word had already spread about her dismissal from the Lucky Dollar, and no one wanted to take a chance on a woman with a reputation for being difficult. By midday, Eleanor was hot, frustrated, and increasingly desperate. She sat down on a bench outside the land office and tried to think of other options. She could offer to do laundry or cooking privately for families, but that would require making connections she had not built during her time here. She could try to leave town, but with so little money, she would not get far. She felt trapped, like walls were closing in from all sides. "You are Eleanor Grace, are you not?" Eleanor looked up to find a woman standing before her, perhaps 30 years old, with a practical expression and calloused hands. She wore a simple dress and an apron, and her hair was pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. "I am," Eleanor said warily. "I am Mary Donovan. I run the boarding house for workers at the timber mill outside town. I heard you were looking for work." Eleanor's heart leapt with hope. "Yes, I am. I'm a good cook, and I work hard." Mary studied her for a long moment. "I also heard you have a temper and do not get along well with others." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I do not tolerate disrespect or dishonesty. If that makes me difficult, then I suppose I am guilty as charged." Something that might have been approval flickered in Mary's eyes. "The men at the mill are rough, and they do not always mind their manners. If I hire you, they will test you, and some of them will try to push boundaries. Can you handle that without causing fights every day?" "I can handle myself," Eleanor said firmly, "but I will not be mistreated or cheated." Mary nodded slowly. "Fair enough. I need someone who can cook for 20 men twice a day and keep the boarding house clean. The pay is $30 a month plus room and board. You would have your own small cabin near the main house. The work is hard and the men can be crude, but if you do your job and do not cause unnecessary trouble, we will get along fine. Interested?" $30 a month was more than Eleanor had been making at the saloon, and having her own space was more than she had dared to hope for. "Yes, I am interested. When would I start?" "Tomorrow morning. The mill is about 3 miles north of town, following the river road." "Can you be there by dawn?" "I will be there," Eleanor promised. Mary gave her more specific directions and instructions about what to bring, then left to continue her errands in town. Eleanor sat on the bench for a few more minutes, feeling a cautious relief. It was not a perfect solution, nothing ever was, but it was a chance, and chances were precious things for women in her position. She spent the rest of the day preparing for the move, which mostly involved packing her few possessions back into her carpet bag and settling her account with Mrs. Patterson, who seemed unsurprised that Eleanor was leaving. That evening, Eleanor sat in her room and tried to feel hopeful about this new opportunity, but a lifetime of disappointments had taught her not to count on anything until it was real and solid in her hands. She set out before dawn the next morning, walking the river road north with her carpet bag in hand. The air was still relatively cool, though the promise of heat hung over the landscape like a threat. The road followed the Colorado River, which flowed brown and sluggish through the desert. Vegetation clustered along its banks cottonwoods and willows and scrubby bushes, but beyond that narrow green corridor, the land was harsh and unforgiving. The timber mill came into view as the sun cleared the horizon. It was a substantial operation, with a large sawmill building, several storage sheds, corrals for the mules that hauled logs down from the mountains, and a collection of rough cabins and tents for the workers. The sound of saws biting into wood was already echoing across the compound, and men moved about with the purposeful activity of a workday beginning. Mary Donovan emerged from a large wooden building that Eleanor assumed was the main boarding house. She waved Eleanor over and led her to a small cabin set slightly apart from the others. It was rough but sturdy, with a single room that held a bed, a table, a chair, and a small stove. A window with real glass looked out toward the river. "This is yours," Mary said. "You can settle in, and then I will show you the kitchen and go over expectations. Breakfast is at 6 and supper is at 7. You will have help with the heavy work, but the cooking and planning is your responsibility." Eleanor set her bag on the bed and looked around her new home. It was small and spare, but it was hers, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a space that belonged to her. "Thank you," she said quietly. Mary's expression softened slightly. "I know what it is like to be a woman alone in this country. I have been where you are. Work hard. Do not let the men rattle you, and we will do fine together." Eleanor nodded and followed Mary to the kitchen, which was attached to the main boarding house. It was larger and better equipped than the saloon kitchen had been, with a massive iron stove, good pots and pans, and a larder stocked with supplies. Mary explained the routine and introduced Eleanor to Sarah, a Mexican woman in her 40s who helped with the cleaning and laundry. Sarah greeted Eleanor with friendly warmth that made Eleanor feel slightly uncomfortable, unused as she was to kindness without strings attached. The work was indeed hard. Cooking for 20 hungry men twice a day required organization and stamina, and the heat in the kitchen was brutal even in the early morning hours. But Eleanor threw herself into it with determination, planning meals that were filling and flavorful, keeping her workspace clean and organized, and refusing to show any sign of weakness or uncertainty. The men, as Mary had warned, tested her. They made crude jokes, tried to take liberties, questioned her cooking, and generally behaved like the rough laborers they were. Eleanor met every challenge with a sharp tongue and an unwavering glare, making it clear that she would not tolerate disrespect. A few of the men pushed harder, and Eleanor pushed back harder still, until Mary had to intervene and make it clear that anyone who could not behave themselves would answer to her. After the first week, an uneasy truce settled over the camp. The men learned that Eleanor's food was excellent, and that antagonizing her was not worth the effort. Eleanor learned which men were genuinely rough but harmless, and which ones needed to be watched carefully. She fell into a routine of work and solitude, spending her days in the kitchen and her evenings alone in her cabin, too tired to do much more than eat a simple supper and fall into bed. It was a hard life, but it was stable, and stability was something Eleanor had not had in years. She began to relax by small degrees, though she never let her guard down completely. She had learned too many times that safety was an illusion that could be shattered in an instant. It was early September, nearly 2 months after Eleanor had started at the mill, when the mountain man arrived. Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing the midday meal when she heard the commotion outside. The sound of the saws had stopped, and men were calling out in greeting. Curious despite herself, Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and stepped to the door to see what was happening. A massive man was dismounting from an equally massive horse in the center of the compound. He stood at least 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun and arms thick with muscle, visible even through his buckskin shirt. His hair was dark brown and hung past his shoulders, held back from his face by a leather cord, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who was utterly sure of himself and his place in the world, his eyes scanning the compound with the alert awareness of someone accustomed to danger. Behind him were 3 mules loaded with bundles of fur pelts, enough to represent months of trapping in the high country. The men gathered around him with the respect and wariness reserved for someone who was clearly dangerous but currently friendly. "William Sutherland," Mary said, appearing beside Eleanor at the door. "He brings pelts down from the mountains a few times a year to trade. Keeps to himself mostly, lives up in the high country. Good man from what I know of him." William Sutherland was speaking with the mill foreman, his voice a deep rumble that Eleanor could not quite make out from this distance. He laughed at something the foreman said, the sound carrying across the compound, and Eleanor found herself staring at the way his whole face transformed with genuine amusement. "Stop gawking and get back to work," Mary said, though her tone was not unkind. "He will be staying for a few days while he does his trading, so you will be cooking for one more. He is not like the mill workers. Treat him with respect, and you will have no trouble." Eleanor bristled at the implication that she was the one who caused trouble, but she held her tongue and returned to her work. Still, she found her thoughts drifting back to the man in the compound, to his size and presence, and the easy way the other men deferred to him. That evening, William Sutherland appeared in the dining hall with the other men for supper. He had to duck to get through the doorway, and when he sat down at the long table, the bench creaked under his weight. Eleanor served the meal as she always did, platters of roasted meat, potatoes, beans, fresh bread, and tried not to stare at him. He ate with the appetite of a man who had been living on jerky and whatever he could hunt, but he had better manners than most of the mill workers, and he thanked her politely when she refilled his plate. After the meal, as Eleanor was cleaning up in the kitchen, Mary came in with William behind her. "This is Eleanor Grace, our cook," Mary said. "Eleanor, this is William Sutherland. He wanted to compliment your cooking personally." Up close, William Sutherland was even more imposing. He had eyes the color of storm clouds, and when he looked at Eleanor, she felt like he was actually seeing her, not just looking past her or at her body the way most men did. There were scars on his hands and a long white line across his left forearm, marks of a hard life lived in dangerous places. "That was the best meal I have had in 6 months, Miss Grace," he said, his voice deep and sincere. "I appreciate the work you put into it." Eleanor found herself momentarily at a loss for words, unused to genuine appreciation without ulterior motives. "You are welcome," she managed. "It is my job." Something flickered in his eyes that might have been amusement. "Still, you do it well. Thank you." He left with Mary, and Eleanor stood in the kitchen feeling strangely off balance. There had been nothing inappropriate in the interaction, nothing that should have affected her, but she could not shake the feeling that something significant had just happened, even if she could not identify what. Over the next few days, William conducted his business in town and around the mill, but he took his meals at the boarding house. Eleanor found herself aware of his presence in a way that made her uncomfortable. She caught herself listening for his voice, watching him from the corner of her eye, noticing details she had no business noticing, the way he moved with surprising grace for such a large man, the kindness with which he treated the mules, the laugh that came easily when he was among people he respected. The mill workers clearly admired him. Eleanor overheard conversations that painted a picture of a man who had come west more than a decade ago, who had made his living trapping in the high mountains, who was known for his honesty and his skill at surviving in conditions that would kill lesser men. He had a reputation for fairness, but also for not tolerating fools or mistreatment, and more than one man had learned the hard way that William Sutherland was not someone to cross. On the third evening, one of the mill workers, a man named Pete, who had been warned several times about his behavior toward Eleanor, had too much to drink and decided to make another attempt at pushing her boundaries. Eleanor was carrying a heavy pot from the kitchen to the dining hall when Pete stepped into her path and grabbed her arm. "Give us a smile, Ellie," he said, his breath reeking of whiskey. "You are too pretty to be so sour all the time." Eleanor jerked her arm free, her eyes flashing with anger. "Do not touch me, and do not call me that. Step aside." Pete laughed and reached for her again. "Come on now, I'm just being friendly. You could stand to be a bit friendlier yourself. No wonder you have got no man. You are wound up tighter than a—" He did not finish the sentence. William Sutherland appeared seemingly out of nowhere, his hand closing around Pete's wrist with enough force that the smaller man yelped in pain. "The lady told you to step aside," William said quietly, but his voice carried a weight of threat that made everyone in the vicinity go still. "I suggest you listen." Pete paled and stepped back immediately, cradling his wrist. "I did not mean nothing by it." "Yes, you did," William said flatly. "And if I see you bothering her again, we are going to have a much longer conversation about respect. Understood?" Pete nodded quickly and hurried away. William turned to Eleanor, his expression gentling. "You all right, Miss Grace?" Eleanor's pride stung at needing rescue, but she was honest enough to admit that the situation could have gone badly without intervention. "I am fine. Thank you, though I could have handled it myself." "I do not doubt it," William said, and he sounded like he meant it. "But you should not have to. Man acts like that. He deserves to be checked." He moved past her to take his seat for supper, leaving Eleanor standing in the doorway with the heavy pot still in her hands and a strange warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the heat of the kitchen. The next morning, William was preparing to leave, loading his traded supplies onto his mules and checking his gear with the methodical care of an experienced outdoorsman. Eleanor was sweeping the front steps of the boarding house when Mary called her over. "William wanted to say goodbye before he heads back to the mountains," Mary said. William was tightening a cinch on his horse when Eleanor approached. He looked up and smiled at her, and Eleanor felt that strange warmth again. "Wanted to thank you again for the fine cooking, Miss Grace," he said. "Best meals I've had in a long time. I will be back in a few months with more pelts, and I look forward to tasting your food again." "Safe travels, Mr. Sutherland," Eleanor said, meaning it. "Call me William," he said. "And may I call you Eleanor?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "If you wish." "I do wish," he said, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than strictly necessary. Then he swung up into his saddle with easy strength, tipped his hat to both women, and rode out of the compound with his string of mules following behind. Eleanor watched him go until he disappeared around the bend in the river road, and only then did she realize Mary was watching her with a knowing expression. "Do not start," Eleanor said sharply, turning back toward the boarding house. "I did not say anything," Mary said, but she was trying not to smile. Eleanor threw herself back into work, trying not to think about William Sutherland or the way he had looked at her or the strange feeling of disappointment that settled over her after he left. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that a man like that would have no interest in a woman like her, that even if he did, she had no intention of letting anyone get close enough to hurt her. But at night, alone in her cabin, she found her thoughts drifting back to storm-gray eyes and a deep voice, and the feeling of being truly seen for the first time in longer than she could remember. The weeks passed in the familiar rhythm of hard work and solitude. Eleanor's cooking continued to be excellent, and the mill workers had learned to give her the respect she demanded. She had begun to save money from her wages, tucking it away in a small tin box hidden in her cabin. She did not have a plan for what she was saving toward, but having money meant having options, and options meant freedom. The weather began to cool as September gave way to October. The brutal summer heat faded to merely uncomfortable warmth, and the leaves on the cottonwoods along the river turned gold. Eleanor had been at the mill for 4 months now, longer than she had stayed in any position since her parents died. The stability was still strange to her, but she was beginning to accept that maybe, possibly, this situation might actually last. It was a cool morning in late October when William Sutherland returned. Eleanor was kneading bread dough in the kitchen when she heard the familiar commotion of his arrival. Her heart gave a traitorous leap, and she firmly told herself to calm down. She had thought about him more than she cared to admit during the past 2 months, but that did not mean anything. He was just a man, and she had no use for men in her life beyond professional interactions. But when he appeared in the doorway of the dining hall that evening for supper, her breath caught despite her best efforts. He looked leaner than before, hardened by months in the mountains, but his smile when he saw her was warm and genuine. "Eleanor," he said, and the way he said her name made something flutter in her chest. "It is good to see you again." "Welcome back, William," she managed, pleased that her voice came out steady. "I hope you had a successful season." "Successful enough," he said, "though I have to admit, one of the things that kept me going through the cold nights was the memory of your cooking. I hope it is as good as I remembered." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm, and she turned quickly back to the kitchen before he could see her blush. What was wrong with her? She did not blush. She did not flutter. She had built walls too high and strong to be breached by a charming smile and kind words. Except William Sutherland did not feel like a breach. He felt like something else entirely, something she did not have words for. Over the next few days, as William conducted his business and prepared for the trip back to his winter camp, Eleanor found herself seeking out reasons to be where he was. She told herself she was just being thorough in her work, just making sure everyone was properly fed and cared for, but she knew she was lying to herself. William seemed to seek her out as well. He helped her carry heavy pots without being asked, stayed after meals to talk with her while she cleaned up, asked her questions about her life, and actually listened to the answers. He did not pry into the painful parts, did not push when she kept things vague, but he made it clear he was interested in knowing her as a person, not just the woman who cooked his meals. On the fourth evening of his visit, after the supper dishes were done and the boarding house was quiet, Eleanor stepped out of her cabin to find William sitting on the steps. He stood when he saw her, his expression slightly uncertain for the first time since she had met him. "I hope you do not mind," he said. "I wanted to talk to you if you have a moment." Eleanor's walls immediately went up. "About what?" William seemed to choose his words carefully. "I've heard some of the men talking. They say you have got a temper like fire, that you are difficult and harsh and not worth the trouble." He paused, his eyes steady on hers. "I wanted to tell you that I do not agree with them. I think you have got fire, yes, but fire is not a bad thing. Fire keeps you warm. Fire keeps you alive. Fire lights the darkness. Any man who complains about a woman having fire is a fool who does not deserve her." Eleanor stared at him, something cracking open inside her chest that she had kept locked away for so long she had forgotten it existed. "Why are you saying this to me?" "Because I think you have been told your whole life that you are too much," William said quietly. "Too angry, too difficult, too unwilling to bend. And I want you to know that at least one person in this world thinks you are exactly right, just as you are." Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. "You do not know me. You do not know what I have done, or why I am the way I am." "You are right, I do not know the whole story," William agreed. "But I know enough to see a woman who has had to fight for everything she has, who has learned to meet the world with her fists up, because that is the only way to survive. I know that because I was like that too once. Still am in some ways. The mountains taught me that there is no shame in being hard when hardness is what keeps you alive." "The mountains," Eleanor repeated, grasping for something to say that would not reveal how much his words affected her. "Is that where you are going now? Back to the high country?" "I've got a winter camp up in the mountains about 40 miles north of here," William said. "Good trapping territory, plenty of game. I will stay up there until spring, then bring the pelts down to trade. It is solitary, but I have always preferred my own company to most people." "That sounds lonely," Eleanor said before she could stop herself. William smiled slightly. "It can be, but it is also peaceful. No one demanding things from you, no one judging you, just you and the land and the work. There is freedom in that." Eleanor understood that more than she could express. "I envy you that freedom." "You could have it too," William said quietly. Eleanor's heart stopped. "What?" William took a step closer, and Eleanor did not back away. "Come with me, to the mountains. Be my wife, share my life, and you will never have to answer to anyone else again. Just us in the high country and the life we build together." Eleanor felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "You cannot be serious. You barely know me. I barely know you." "I know enough," William said firmly. "I know you are strong and brave and honest. I know you work harder than any two people I have ever met. I know you have been hurt and betrayed, and you have learned not to trust easily. I know you deserve better than cooking for ungrateful men in a mill camp for the rest of your life. And I know that from the moment I first saw you, I felt something I have never felt before, and it has not faded in the months I was away. If anything, it got stronger." "This is insane," Eleanor whispered, but she did not sound convincing even to herself. "Maybe," William agreed, "but I have lived my whole adult life in wild places, and I have learned to trust my instincts. My instincts tell me that you are the woman I have been waiting for without even knowing I was waiting. And I think, if you are honest with yourself, you feel it too." Eleanor wanted to deny it, wanted to laugh in his face and walk away, wanted to protect herself the way she always had. But the truth was, she did feel something when she looked at him. She felt seen and understood in a way she had never experienced before. She felt safe, which was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all, because safety was an illusion that could be ripped away at any moment. "I do not know how to do this," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I do not know how to be soft or sweet or whatever it is that men want. I am all sharp edges and anger, and I do not know how to be anything else." "Good," William said, and his voice was fierce. "I do not want soft and sweet. I want you exactly as you are. Your fire, your strength, your sharp edges. That is what I want. That is what I need. Someone who can stand beside me in the hard places and not break. Someone who knows what it is to survive and who does not apologize for what survival required." Eleanor felt the tears spill over despite her best efforts. "What if I ruin it? What if I drive you away like I have driven everyone else away?" William reached out slowly, giving her time to pull back, and when she did not, he gently wiped the tears from her cheeks with his rough thumbs. His hands were so large they could have crushed her, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "You will not drive me away. I'm not like the others. I'm not going anywhere unless you tell me to go, and even then I would probably be stubborn about it." Eleanor laughed despite herself, a wet sound that was half sob. "This is crazy." "Probably," William agreed, "but sometimes the best things in life are a little bit crazy. What do you say, Eleanor? Will you take a chance on me, on us?" Eleanor looked up at him, at this massive man with kind eyes and a patient heart, and felt something shift inside her. For the first time in her adult life, she wanted to say yes. She wanted to trust. She wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have something good. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." William's face split into a grin that transformed him from intimidating to almost boyish, and he lifted her off her feet in a hug that squeezed the air from her lungs. When he set her back down, he was laughing, and Eleanor found herself laughing too, dizzy with terror and hope in equal measure. "We will do this right," William said, still holding her hands. "We will find a preacher tomorrow, get married proper, and then we will head up to the mountains before the first snow. I will spend the winter showing you that you made the right choice." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. William squeezed her hands once more, then reluctantly let her go. "Get some rest. We have got a big day tomorrow." He walked away toward the bunk where he was staying, and Eleanor stood outside her cabin for a long time, looking up at the stars and trying to believe that this was real, that she was really going to marry a mountain man she had known for less than 2 weeks total and go live in the wilderness. It was absolutely insane. It was also the first thing that had felt right in years. The next day was a whirlwind. Mary was shocked, but supportive when Eleanor told her the news, and she helped Eleanor pack her few belongings and prepare for the journey. The mill workers had mixed reactions, some congratulating William, others muttering about how Eleanor had probably trapped him somehow. Eleanor ignored them all, too focused on the enormous step she was about to take to care about their opinions. They rode into Fort Yuma that afternoon, and William found the preacher who served the small church. The man was elderly and kind, and if he had reservations about performing a marriage for a couple who had known each other such a short time, he kept them to himself. They stood in the simple church with Mary and 2 of William's trading partners as witnesses, and Eleanor spoke her vows in a voice that trembled only slightly. When William slid a simple gold band onto her finger, he had purchased it from the general store. That morning, Eleanor felt the full weight of what she had done settle onto her shoulders. She was married. She was Eleanor Sutherland now, bound to this man by law and promise. William kissed her gently after the preacher pronounced them married, his lips soft against hers, and Eleanor felt heat flood through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. When they pulled apart, his eyes held promises that made her simultaneously nervous and eager. They had a simple meal at the hotel to celebrate, and then William said they needed to head out. "I want to get at least 10 miles before we camp for the night," he explained. "The earlier we start, the better." Eleanor changed from her good dress into a practical split riding skirt that Mary had given her as a wedding gift, and William helped her mount the horse he had purchased for her that morning, a sturdy gray mare with a gentle disposition. They said their goodbyes to Mary and the few others who had gathered to see them off, And then they were riding north, leaving Fort Yuma and Eleanor's old life behind. The first few hours were surreal. Eleanor kept glancing at the gold band on her finger, at the broad back of her husband riding ahead of her, trying to make it feel real. She had woken up that morning as Eleanor Grace, alone in the world, and now she was Eleanor Sutherland, married to a mountain man and heading into the wilderness. If someone had told her a month ago this would happen, she would have laughed in their face. They made camp that evening in a sheltered spot near the river. William set up the tent with practiced efficiency, while Eleanor gathered wood for a fire. He showed her how he wanted things arranged and explained what their days would be like once they reached his winter camp. He was patient and thorough, treating her like a partner rather than a burden, and Eleanor felt some of her anxiety ease. They ate a simple supper of beans and bacon, and then William banked the fire and gestured toward the tent. "We should get some rest. Long day tomorrow." Eleanor's anxiety spiked again. They were married, which meant certain expectations. And while she understood the basic mechanics of what happened between husbands and wives, her actual experience was non-existent. She had kissed a boy once when she was 16, but nothing beyond that. The thought of intimacy with William was both thrilling and terrifying. William seemed to read her nervousness. "Eleanor," he said gently, "we do not have to do anything you are not ready for. Marriage is a partnership, and I want you to feel safe and comfortable. We have got all the time in the world." Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude and affection for this man who seemed to understand her without her having to explain. "Thank you," she said quietly. They settled into the tent, and William wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "Come here," he said, opening his arms. "At least let me keep you warm." Eleanor hesitated, then moved into his embrace. He wrapped his arms around her, and she rested her head against his broad chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. His warmth surrounded her, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Eleanor felt safe enough to truly relax. "This is nice," she murmured. She felt William smile against her hair. "Yes, it is. Get some sleep, wife. Tomorrow we start our new life together." Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself drift off, held secure in the arms of the man she had chosen to trust with her heart. The journey to William's winter camp took 3 days of steady travel. They followed the river north, then turned east into the foothills as the land began to rise toward the mountains. The landscape changed gradually from desert to pine forest, and the air grew cooler and cleaner with each mile. William was a patient teacher, showing Eleanor how to read the land, how to move quietly through the forest, how to spot signs of game and water. He told her stories of his years in the mountains, of close calls with bears and storms, of the satisfaction of living by his own skill and strength. Eleanor listened and learned, and slowly the tension that had been her constant companion for years began to unwind. At night, they shared the tent and William's warmth, and gradually Eleanor grew accustomed to his presence, to his touch, to the feeling of being close to another person. William never pushed, never demanded, but his affection was clear in 1,000 small ways, the way he made sure she had the best portions of food, the way he adjusted the saddle on her horse to make her more comfortable, the way he looked at her like she was something precious. On the 3rd night, as they lay together in the tent with the sound of wind in the pines above them, Eleanor turned in William's arms and kissed him. It started tentative and uncertain, but William responded with a gentle passion that made heat pool low in her belly. His hands moved carefully over her body, always asking permission with his touch, and Eleanor gave it, wanting to know this man who was her husband, wanting to understand what this physical connection could be. Their joining was slow and careful, with William taking time to make sure she was ready, that she was not in pain, that she was with him every step of the way. When it was over, Eleanor lay in his arms feeling changed in some fundamental way. The vulnerability of what they had just shared should have terrified her, but instead, she felt closer to William than she had ever felt to another human being. "Are you all right?" William asked softly, his hand stroking her hair. "I'm better than all right," Eleanor said, and she meant it. "I feel like I can finally breathe for the first time in years." William kissed her forehead. "Good, because I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you always feel like you can breathe." They reached William's winter camp the next afternoon. It was tucked into a valley between 2 ridges, sheltered from the worst of the weather, with a clear stream running nearby and thick forest all around. The cabin was solid and well built, larger than Eleanor had expected, with a stone fireplace and real windows with shutters. There was a barn for the horses and mules, a smokehouse, and a root cellar dug into the hillside. "You built all this yourself?" Eleanor asked, impressed despite herself. "Over several seasons," William said. "Figured if I was going to spend months at a time up here, I might as well be comfortable. And I suppose part of me always hoped I might someday have someone to share it with, even if I did not admit it to myself." Eleanor walked through the cabin, taking in the sturdy furniture, the well-stocked shelves, the furs piled on the bed. It was rough by town standards, but it was clean and solid and made with care. "It is wonderful," she said honestly. William came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "Welcome home, Eleanor." Home. Eleanor tested the word in her mind and found that it fit. This place, this man, this life. It felt like home in a way nothing had since her parents died. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for choosing me." "Thank you for saying yes," William replied, and she could hear the smile in his voice. They fell into a rhythm over the following weeks. William checked his trap lines every few days, and Eleanor learned to skin and stretch the pelts, to cure the meat, to keep the cabin warm and organized. She cooked meals that made William groan with pleasure, and she learned to make bread in the Dutch oven and preserve vegetables in the root cellar. The work was hard, but it was satisfying in a way her previous jobs had never been, because she was working for herself and her husband, building something that belonged to them. The first snow came in mid-November, dusting the valley in white and making everything look clean and new. William taught Eleanor to snowshoe, and they explored the winter landscape together. He showed her where the deer came down from the high country, where the best fishing holes were on the stream, where a family of foxes had their den. Eleanor discovered that she loved the solitude of the mountains. There was a peace here that she had never experienced in towns, where she had always felt judged and found wanting. Here, there was no one to please but herself and William, no expectations beyond those they set for themselves. Her anger, which had been her constant companion for so long, began to fade, replaced by a contentment she had not known was possible. William seemed to blossom as well. The wariness that had been visible beneath his friendly exterior in town disappeared completely in the mountains. He laughed easily, sang while he worked, and showed Eleanor an affectionate playfulness that she found utterly charming. He would toss her over his shoulder and carry her around the cabin when she was being stubborn, would sneak up behind her and nuzzle her neck while she was cooking, would pull her into impromptu dances in front of the fireplace with no music but his humming. And at night, in their bed piled high with furs, they learned each other's bodies with increasing confidence and passion. William was a generous and attentive lover, and Eleanor discovered that she had a capacity for physical pleasure she had never suspected. The vulnerability of intimacy still frightened her sometimes, but William's patience and care made it easier to let down her walls, to allow herself to be truly known. They talked for hours in front of the fire, sharing their histories and their hopes. William told her about growing up on a farm in Ohio, about heading west after his parents died in a cholera outbreak, about the hard years learning to survive in the mountains. Eleanor told him about her lonely childhood, about losing her parents and being betrayed by the few family members she had left, about the struggle to survive alone in a world that had no place for women without protection. "You were surviving the only way you could," William said when she finished. "There is no shame in that. The fact that you are still here, still fighting, still yourself, that takes more courage than most people will ever have." "I do not feel courageous," Eleanor admitted. "I feel like I have just been running scared my whole adult life." "Courage is not the absence of fear," William said firmly. "It is acting despite the fear. You have been courageous every single day of your life, Eleanor. You just could not see it because you were too busy surviving." Eleanor curled against him, absorbing his words, trying to believe them. It was hard to let go of the story she had told herself about her life, but William's perspective offered a new way of looking at things. Maybe she had not been weak or broken. Maybe she had been strong all along. Winter deepened, and the snow piled high around the cabin. The world contracted to the warm space they had created together, and Eleanor found herself happier than she had ever been. Her temper, which had been so quick to flare in town, rarely emerged here. There was nothing to fight against, no one trying to diminish or control her. She could simply be herself, and that self was apparently much calmer and more content than she had realized. "You have changed since we came up here," William observed one evening as they sat by the fire. "You are softer, happier." "Is that a bad thing?" Eleanor asked, slightly defensive despite herself. "It is a wonderful thing," William said, pulling her closer. "But I want you to know that I would have loved you just as much if you had stayed the fierce, angry woman I met in the mill camp. You do not have to change for me, Eleanor. I just want you to be whoever you truly are." "I think maybe this is who I truly am," Eleanor said slowly. "The anger was armor, protection I needed in places that were not safe. But I do not need armor here, not with you." "No, you do not," William agreed. "You are safe with me, always." Christmas came, and they celebrated quietly with a special meal and small gifts they had made for each other. Eleanor had knitted William a warm scarf from wool she had brought from the mill, and he had carved her a beautiful set of wooden spoons with intricate designs on the handles. They made love in front of the fire with the snow falling softly outside, and Eleanor thought that she had never been happier than she was in this moment. The new year of 1875 arrived, and with it came the deepest snows of the winter. They were snowed in for nearly 2 weeks, unable to venture far from the cabin, but Eleanor did not mind. She had everything she needed within these 4 walls: warmth, food, and the man she loved. Yes, loved. Eleanor had not said the words out loud yet, but she acknowledged the truth to herself during those long, quiet days. She loved William Sutherland with a depth and intensity that would have terrified her 6 months ago. He had become the center of her world, the person she thought of first when she woke, and last before she slept. He was her partner, her protector, her best friend, and her lover, and she could not imagine her life without him now. She told him on a cold February night when the wind was howling outside and they were wrapped together under the firs. "I love you," she said quietly, her heart pounding. "I know I have not said it before, but I do. I love you so much it frightens me sometimes." William went very still, then tightened his arms around her. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I have loved you since the first moment I saw you, standing in that kitchen with fire in your eyes and strength in every line of your body. I loved you when everyone said you were too difficult, too angry, too much. I loved you more when I got to know the woman behind the armor. And I love you even more now that I have had the privilege of seeing you bloom into who you were always meant to be." Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "How did I get so lucky? How did I find you?" "I think we found each other," William said, "and I think we are going to spend the rest of our lives being grateful for it." February turned to March, and the snow began to melt. The streams swelled with runoff, and the first green shoots appeared on the south-facing slopes. William began preparing for the trek back to Fort Yuma to trade the winter's pelts, and Eleanor helped him organize and bundle the furs. "I'm going to come with you this time," she announced one morning. "I want to see Mary and let her know how happy I am. And I want to walk through town holding your hand and let everyone see that I am not alone anymore." William grinned at her. "I was hoping you would say that. I was not looking forward to leaving you behind." They set out in early April, when the trails were passable but the high country was still too cold for comfortable living. The journey back to Fort Yuma took 4 days, and Eleanor was struck by how much her perspective had changed. The landscape she had viewed with such trepidation 6 months ago now felt familiar and welcoming. She was no longer a desperate woman running from failure. She was Eleanor Sutherland, wife of a mountain man, heading into town to conduct business. Fort Yuma was exactly as Eleanor remembered it, but she felt like a different person walking down its dusty streets. Several people recognized her and stared in surprise, and Eleanor met their gazes with calm confidence. She was not ashamed of who she was or the life she had chosen. Mary was delighted to see her, and the 2 women embraced warmly. "Look at you," Mary said, holding Eleanor at arm's length. "You are glowing. Married life clearly agrees with you." "It does," Eleanor said with a smile that felt like it might split her face. "I have never been happier, Mary. Thank you for giving me that job. If I had not been at the mill, I would never have met William." "I think you two were meant to find each other," Mary said. "Some things are just fate." William conducted his trading over the next few days, getting good prices for his pelts and restocking their supplies for the coming months. He bought Eleanor a new dress and a pair of sturdy boots, and he surprised her with a small music box that played a tinkling melody. "For our cabin," he said, "so you can have music even when I'm not there to sing for you." Eleanor treasured the gift, but what she treasured more was the way William treated her in town. He introduced her as his wife with obvious pride, kept her close to his side, and made it clear to anyone who might have had thoughts otherwise that she was under his protection. Several of the men from the mill saw them and tipped their hats respectfully, and even Harold Jenkins avoided eye contact when they passed the Lucky Dollar saloon. On their last night in town, they had supper with Mary at the boarding house. The mill workers greeted Eleanor with genuine warmth, and she realized that her reputation had changed. She was no longer the difficult woman with the sharp tongue. She was William Sutherland's wife, and that carried its own respect in this rough country. "Are you happy, Eleanor?" Mary asked quietly after the meal, when the two women had a moment alone. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Eleanor said honestly. "I thought I would spend my whole life fighting and alone, but William has shown me that there is another way. I can be strong and still be loved. I can be myself and still be valued. It is a gift I never expected to receive." "You deserve it," Mary said firmly. "You deserve every bit of happiness you have found." They left Fort Yuma the next morning and headed back into the mountains. The valley was green and beautiful when they returned, with wildflowers blooming on the hillsides and birds singing in the trees. They fell back into their routine, but now there was a new element they were planning for the future. "I have been thinking," William said one evening in late May. "This cabin is good for 2 people, but if we are going to have children someday, we will need more space. I was thinking we could add another room, maybe expand the barn as well." Eleanor's heart skipped. They had not talked specifically about children, though she had assumed they would come eventually. "You want children?" "I do if you do," William said. "I think you would be a wonderful mother, Eleanor. Fierce and protective and strong. Our children would be lucky to have you." "I want them too," Eleanor admitted. "I want to build a family with you. I want to give our children the kind of home I never had, one filled with love and safety and acceptance." "Then that is what we will do," William said, pulling her into his arms. "We will build that home and that family together." Summer arrived in full glory, and they worked together to expand the cabin. William did the heavy construction work, but Eleanor helped wherever she could, hauling logs and mixing mortar and learning the satisfaction of building something with her own hands. They added a bedroom and expanded the main living area, and Eleanor began to envision children playing on the porch, learning to hunt and trap and survive in these beautiful mountains. In August, Eleanor realized she had missed her monthly cycle. She waited to be sure, not wanting to get William's hopes up, but when September arrived and she still had not bled, she knew she was carrying their child. She told William that evening after supper, simply and directly, "I am with child. I think I am about 2 months along." William's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, joy, wonder, and finally a fierce protectiveness that made Eleanor's heart clench. He dropped to his knees in front of her and pressed his face against her still flat belly. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for this gift." Eleanor ran her fingers through his long hair, feeling tears prick her eyes. "We are going to be parents." "We are going to be the best parents," William said fiercely. "This child is going to grow up knowing they are loved and wanted and valued. They are going to have the kind of childhood we both deserved and did not get." The pregnancy was not easy. Eleanor suffered from terrible nausea in the early months, and William hovered anxiously, trying to find food she could keep down and doing extra work so she could rest. As her belly grew, Eleanor found herself increasingly uncomfortable, but also filled with a sense of purpose and anticipation she had never experienced before. William was endlessly attentive. He rubbed her swollen feet, brought her little gifts he found in the forest, and talked to her belly every night, telling their unborn child stories and promises. He built a beautiful cradle from pine wood and carved tiny animals to hang above it. He hunted extra game and smoked the meat, preparing for the months when Eleanor would be recovering and caring for a newborn. They decided not to go to Fort Yuma for the winter trading. William wanted Eleanor to be comfortable and safe, and traveling while heavily pregnant was too risky. Instead, he made arrangements for a trading partner to handle his pelts, and they settled in for the winter with just the two of them, preparing for the arrival of their child. Eleanor went into labor on a cold night in early March of 1876. The pains started in the evening and gradually intensified through the night. William stayed by her side, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, and doing his best to keep her comfortable despite his own terror at what she was going through. The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when William feared he might lose her. But Eleanor was strong, stronger than either of them had realized, and just after dawn broke, she pushed their son into the world. William caught the baby, his hands shaking, and placed him on Eleanor's chest. The infant was red and wrinkled and screaming lustily, and he was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever seen. "A boy," Eleanor breathed, exhausted and elated. "We have a son." "He is perfect," William said, tears streaming down his face. "You are perfect. Eleanor, you are so strong. I'm in awe of you." They named him Thomas, after William's father, and from the moment he entered the world, he became the center of their universe. William was a devoted father, taking on as much of the baby care as Eleanor would allow him, changing cloths and walking the floor with Thomas when he fussed and singing him songs in his deep voice. Eleanor discovered that motherhood came more naturally to her than she had expected. Her fierce protectiveness, which had once been turned toward defending herself, now focused entirely on this tiny person who depended on them for everything. She nursed him and rocked him and whispered promises that he would always be safe, always be loved, always be free to be exactly who he was meant to be. As Thomas grew from infant to baby to toddler, the cabin filled with laughter and chaos and love. William taught his son to walk and to track animals in the snow and to be gentle with the creatures they hunted. Eleanor taught him to cook and to read from the few books they owned and to think for himself. When Thomas was 2 years old, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their second son, James, was born in the summer of 1878, an easier birth that left Eleanor much less depleted. William was overjoyed to have another son, and Thomas was fascinated by his baby brother. Eleanor watched her family grow and felt a contentment so deep it sometimes brought her to tears. This was everything she had never dared to hope for: a husband who loved her, children who thrived, a home that was safe and warm and filled with joy. They made the trip to Fort Yuma every spring and fall, the whole family now, trading pelts and restocking supplies and letting the boys experience life in town. Thomas and James were healthy, happy children, strong and confident in the way children raised with love and security always were. People who had known Eleanor in her old life were amazed by the transformation, but Eleanor knew the truth: she had not changed as much as her circumstances had. She had always been capable of love and softness. She had just needed a safe place to let those qualities emerge. In the fall of 1880, when Thomas was 4 and James was 2, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant for a third time. This pregnancy was harder than the others, and Eleanor spent much of it exhausted and uncomfortable. William hired a young woman from town to come stay with them for a few months to help with the boys and the housework, giving Eleanor time to rest and prepare. Their daughter, Rose, was born in the spring of 1881, a tiny, perfect girl with her mother's green eyes and her father's dark hair. William wept when he held her for the first time, this little daughter who wrapped her tiny fingers around his and stole his heart completely. "She is perfect," William whispered, cradling Rose with a gentleness that belied his size. "Our little wildflower." Eleanor watched her husband with their daughter and felt her heart overflow. They had built something beautiful here in these mountains: a family, a home, a life filled with love and laughter and purpose. The angry, desperate woman she had been when she arrived in Fort Yuma felt like someone from another lifetime. The years passed in a blur of growth and change. Thomas and James learned to trap and hunt alongside their father, becoming skilled woodsmen in their own right. Rose grew into a fierce, independent girl who climbed trees and caught fish and refused to be left behind when her brothers went adventuring. Eleanor taught all 3 children to read and write and think critically, determined that they would have the education she had cobbled together on her own. In the summers, they would sometimes take extended trips into the deeper mountains, exploring new territory and teaching the children about the land. In the winters, they would gather around the fire in the cabin, now expanded to accommodate their growing family, and and tell stories and play games and simply enjoy being together. Eleanor never lost her fire entirely. She could still be sharp-tongued when the situation called for it, and she remained fiercely protective of her family. But the constant anger that had driven her for so many years had transformed into something else, a passionate commitment to building and protecting the life she and William had created. William remained the steady, strong presence he had always been. His love for Eleanor never wavered, and he told her often how grateful he was that she had taken a chance on a rough mountain man all those years ago. They still made love with the same passion they had as newlyweds, and they still talked for hours in front of the fire, though now they often had small listeners who would creep out of bed to hear the end of their parents' stories. The years were not without their challenges. There were harsh winters and lean times, illnesses and injuries, and the constant work of maintaining their life in the wilderness. But they faced everything together, and that made all the difference. When Rose turned 10 in 1891, Eleanor was 40 years old and William was 43. They sat on the porch of their expanded cabin one summer evening, watching their children play in the meadow, and reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked. "Choosing me that day, taking on a woman with a temper and no faith in happy endings?" William turned to look at her, his expression softening. "Not for one single second. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Eleanor Sutherland. You and these children and this life we have built. I thank God every day that I walked into that mill camp and found you." "I was so scared," Eleanor admitted. "When you asked me to marry you, I was terrified I would ruin it somehow, that I would drive you away." "I know," William said, taking her hand. "But I also knew that the fire in you was not something to be feared. Fire keeps you warm. Fire keeps you alive. Fire lights the way through darkness. I wanted that fire in my life, and I have never regretted that choice." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the sun set over the mountains that had become their home. "They were right, you know, the people who said I had a temper like fire." "Yes, they were," William agreed. "But I was right too. You have kept me warm for 17 years, Eleanor, and I plan on staying warm for the rest of my life." Their children came running up to the porch then, Thomas and James good-naturedly arguing about who had caught the biggest fish, Rose laughing at both of them. The family went inside together as darkness fell, the cabin glowing with lamplight and ringing with voices and laughter. Eleanor stood at the stove preparing supper, surrounded by the noise and chaos of her family, and felt a peace so complete it brought tears to her eyes. She had spent so many years angry and alone, fighting just to survive, convinced that happiness was something other people experienced but never her. But she'd been wrong. Happiness had been waiting for her all along, in the form of a massive mountain man who had seen past her sharp edges to the woman underneath, who had loved her fierceness instead of trying to break it, who had given her a safe place to finally put down her armor and just be. She had kept him warm with her fire, but he had given her something just as valuable, a home where her fire could burn bright without fear of being extinguished, where her strength was valued instead of condemned, where she was loved not despite who she was, but because of it. Years continued to pass, and their children grew into adulthood. Thomas eventually built his own cabin a few miles from theirs and started his own family. James decided to try his hand at trading, spending part of each year traveling, but always returning to the mountains he loved. Rose, their wildflower, fell in love with a young man from Fort Yuma and brought him back to the mountains to ask for her parents' blessing. William and Eleanor became grandparents, then great-grandparents, watching their family tree spread and grow. They aged together, William's dark hair turning silver, Eleanor's auburn fading to gray, but their love for each other only deepened with time. On a warm summer evening in 1905, when Eleanor was 54 and William was 57, they sat together on the porch where they had sat countless times before. Their children and grandchildren were visiting, the cabin and surrounding area full of family and noise and life. "We did it," Eleanor said softly, taking William's hand. "We built something beautiful." "We did," William agreed. "And it all started because I had the good sense to see that your fire was exactly what I needed." Eleanor laughed, the sound carrying across the meadow. "And I had the good sense to take a chance on a mountain man who saw past everyone else's complaints to who I really was." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The mountains rose around them, eternal and unchanging, and in their valley, the family they had built together laughed and talked and carried on the legacy of love that William and Eleanor had started all those years ago. Eleanor's temper, once a source of shame and rejection, had become part of the foundation of a life filled with love and purpose. Her fire had indeed kept William warm through countless winters, but more than that, it had lit the way for a family to grow and thrive in the wilderness. And William, the mountain man who had seen value where others saw only difficulty, had given Eleanor the greatest gift of all, the freedom to be exactly who she was, fire and all, and to be loved not in spite of it, but because of it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, William pulled Eleanor close, and she rested her head on his shoulder just as she had done thousands of times before. Tomorrow they would wake and begin another day in the life they had built together. But tonight, they simply sat and appreciated the journey that had brought them here, grateful for the moment when their paths had crossed and they had been brave enough to choose each other. The cabin behind them glowed with lamplight and echoed with the voices of their family, a testament to the truth William had known from the very beginning, that Eleanor's fire was not something to be feared or suppressed, but something to be cherished and protected. Because that fire had not only kept him warm, but had illuminated both their lives with a love that would burn bright for generations to come.